So, hey, welcome all you wiretappers. Good to be back here in the studio of Gangland Wire. I have The Last Mob Lawyer. Now, we did a series on mob lawyers, Bruce Cutler and what's his name, Jerry Nagel, and a bunch of those guys. Well, I have Chris Franzblau. Now, he has written a book called The Last Mob Lawyer. And I started looking at his stuff and the promos that his editor put out, and he really has had an interesting career. He did some stuff with Meyer Lansky and around the Hoffa case, and he's got a lot of really interesting stories. So welcome, Chris. I'm really happy to have you on the show.
Thank you. Good morning.
Chris, tell the guys a little bit about how your law school experience and your early practice of law, how you developed into becoming a defense lawyer. You don't just jump out and start defending big-time criminals. We know that. So where'd you go to law school?
Well, I went to law school at Duke University in North Carolina.
Yeah,
And
kind of a good Southern school almost, huh? After you got out of law school, then I believe you went in the service. I believe we talked a little bit earlier. You went in the service. So tell the guys about, and you went in as in the JAG Corps, the Judge Advocate General. Is that what you went in as a lawyer in
no,
the
I
Navy?
didn't. Not quite. I went to this very extensive training to become a naval officer before there was a JAG unit in the Navy.
Okay.
And then during that period of time, though, they sent me to what's called, after we finished that hectic program, the Navy sent me to a very high, top secret cryptography school so that I could have those kind of duties if I were assigned to that. And then they sent me to Navy Justice School, so because I'd been a lawyer, so that I could also do court-martial work in the Navy. When I got out of that was all training in Newport, and then I was assigned to an admiral down in Naval Air Station in Pensacola, Florida, and Guantanamo Bay, Cuba was part of the command of the Pensacola admiral in Florida.
The Last Mob Lawyer. You're going to get out of the Navy. You're going to go into private practice, I believe. Now this book, guys, I want to read you something about this book. Joe Pistone, a.k.a. Donnie Brasco, said, "The Last Mob Lawyer, True Stories from the Man Who Defended Some of the Biggest Names in Organized Crime. It's a book that pulls back the curtain on mob life in a way only an insider could." Chris Franzblau's extraordinary legal career offers a fascinating glimpse into the dangers, the characters, and the often bizarre legal wrangling that defines the mob heyday. The Last Mob Lawyer is an essential read for anyone interested in the darker side of American history. So it sounds like a really good read and a fascinating read for a mob fan, of which my guys out there that are listening, my regular listeners especially, they're mob fans. They want to know all the intimate behind the scenes details, and I know you've got some being the lawyer, and you're the first actual mob lawyer I've talked to. I only talked to a guy who was a lawyer who studied mob lawyers, so you're the first one I've talked to. Guys, listen to Chris tell about a little bit about how he got into defending the mob or defending organized crime guys. Again, you just don't drop out of law school, the Navy, and defending mob guys. How did that come about, Chris?
Well, ironically, before I got out of the Navy, just shortly before, which was in the late 50s, early 60s, that's when the federal government was starting to unwind this organization they call La Cosa Nostra and organized crime and the mob. That's the way they had denoted these investigations. It started with Hoffa and McClellan, and then there was that famous meeting in Appalachia. But I wasn't even here then because I was still in the Navy. So I got out of the Navy, and then I wound up as a prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office. And that was the beginning of the prosecutions of organized crime, basically by Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General when John Kennedy was president. And I was in the U.S. Attorney's Office doing investigations, criminal investigations. So I'd done some criminal work in the court martials in the Navy, so it was a natural for me to go to the U.S. Attorney's Office in New Jersey. So when I got out, as luck would have it, a couple of the well-known criminal defense lawyers died. There weren't too many people doing that kind of work. And as luck would have it, coincidentally, when I was a young man, a boy, a teenager, I knew some people who were later identified as organized crime figures, mostly, for example, Jerry Catena, or the guy they called the Boot, Boyardo, the Boot. And because they played golf at the same country club, and I was a pretty skillful golfer at that time, as was the admiral in Pensacola. So that all worked out very well. So they knew me, as luck would have it, and I came out of the U.S. Attorney's Office as organized crime was developing. Then what happened was, very early on, because I done this federal work, I represented a labor leader named Riggy, who later went to prison, and his father in that one union, and the father was being deported, and I tried that case, and we beat the deportation at that back then at different times. And then I got to meet Sam the Plumber, the famous Sam the Plumber, Sam DeCavalcanti,
Yeah.
and that opened up a Pandora's box, because in that I uncovered the fact that J. Edgar Hoover had done these very secret investigations, wiretapping and so forth, in Sam the Plumber's office without a search warrant. And then when I asked for the discovery, they had to, after a year and a half of trying not to have to produce that discovery, then they had to divulge it, and they divulged it to the newspapers, and it uncovered this huge amount of organized crime, the interrelationships, and so forth. And that kind of put me on the map. And I was very young at that time. I was in my early 30s, probably.
Really, Chris, that really almost put the mafia on the national map, almost as much as Appalachian and some of these other things, because those tapes were dynamite, and they released, there was the transcripts of some of those tapes of Richie the Boot talking so candidly about the mafia and everything. They were dynamite. So you're the guy that really caused those to be released. That's really interesting.
Yes, at that time, Giuliano, and he was the U.S. attorney in New York. And after the Appalachia meeting, all the later people who are identified in organized crime were in Appalachia. And
Yeah.
then there were indictments in New York, and that's when I started to represent Catena. And then it went to the New Jersey State Investigation Commission, and they found, and he wouldn't answer questions. He took the Fifth Amendment, and we took that to the United States Supreme Court and lost. And he did almost 5 years in civil contempt because he wouldn't answer questions.
Yeah.
And then we finally got him out. I did, before the New Jersey Supreme Court. That was the first case of its kind based on cruel and unusual punishment. So finally, I was able to get him extricated after doing almost 5 years. He was then almost 75 years old.
Wow. Yeah. See, we've got a picture here of a young SM Chris Franzblau with Geraldo Catena as they arrive in Trenton for an appearance before the Supreme Court. So that's look pretty young in that picture.
Well, he was one of the guys who was up at Appalachia.
Yeah, he was.
And then he had to be represented in New York when Giuliani was the U.S. attorney there, and then we had some issues over there, which was interesting over there, because when he had to appear at the grand jury, they assembled a lot of the people from Appalachia, who were all in the waiting room for the long grand jury at the same time. Catena was called in, and he came out to consult with me. And as he was consulting with me, another attorney had a scuffle right at our feet. A fight began right then, and the guy that the other lawyer tackled got away with a suitcase that seemed to have an aerial out side and got away. It seemed like it was an FBI officer who was trying to overhear the conversations
Wow.
outside that grand jury room. That resulted in my making an issue out of it. And then Catena got his subpoena to testify was withdrawn.
Wow, that's
So
I
that
tell
was
you that
exciting.
that FBI. They were aggressive back then, and they had. I guess there was really no exact law against technical surveillance,
Correct.
wiretapping, or
You're correct.
hidden microphones. You couldn't use it in court, but there were until what 1968, I think, at that Omnibus Crime Control Act is for when they actually created a law which had a path to get a hidden microphone or a wiretap. But before that, there was just no path, but you just couldn't use it. But it was just embarrassing. I mean, it happened in Kansas City too, and all major cities. The
Well, it
FBI
happened
had
in
those hidden
Atlanta too,
yeah.
which was also interesting when it came out that they had wiretapped some conversations between Martin Luther King
Oh yeah.
and Cassius Clay, and that came out as a result. It all came out at the same time, so
Yeah.
that
Pretty
was an
embarrassing.
embarrassment to the to J. Edgar Hoover and to
Yeah.
Robert Kennedy.
Yeah. It was one thing to do this to members of the mafia, but there's another thing to do this to actual political figures, which is what they were. So that was really a black eye for the FBI as a whole, and J. Edgar Hoover in particular. So I guess you talk about Jimmy Hoffa and Tony Provenzano, who Tony Provenzano was from New Jersey. Is that, from these New Jersey connections here with Gyp DiCarlo and Richie the Boot and those guys? Is that how you got in with Tony Provenzano?
Well, Tony Provenzano had been indicted and convicted of some labor racketeering. I didn't represent him at that time, but they decided there were some issues as to whether the previous lawyer for the union was responsible for taking some of the bribes or that had taken place in that conviction. So the union decided to get rid of that lawyer. His name was Jacob Friedland, who was a state senator in New Jersey. There was a very infamous, wonderful, brilliant lawyer, former attorney general in New Jersey named David Wilentz, who was the prosecutor of the famous kidnapping case, a Limburg case, which was
Oh yeah.
an international case. And he knew me. And so when the lawyers who were representing Tony Pro and needed to get a new lawyer to replace Jacob Friedland, they were from New York. They contacted David Wilentz, and he recommended that they needed a lawyer to keep that union clean and the pension funds clean. And so all of a sudden, I was called upon based upon his recommendation, and I began almost overnight to represent several of the major Teamster unions and a state council of Teamsters throughout the state and several of the bigger pension funds. And so that's how I got to represent Tony Pro. That's a long story, but
Yeah. No,
it's
but it's
interesting.
interesting how those I like those details, how those things work. Now I have a question, I guess maybe personally for you, Chris. I want your opinion on this, and maybe as a way of an explanation for guys. A lot of people think that because you're a lawyer and you defend the Teamsters or Tony Provenzano or Jerry Catena or some of these other big time mobsters, that somehow you're part of the mob, that somehow you have this guilty knowledge of what's going on. And I know Oscar Goodman is off. He really never was, but I know a lot of FBI agents and people involved in the investigation of the mob, will say, oh no, he was part of it. And a lot of lawyers. Now, can you explain the kind of the professional relationship that a lawyer has that with a mobster, that he doesn't become part of the crime itself?
Number one is that when I was a young man, a teenager, I had known Catena before he was alleged to be a member of organized crime or Boyardo or the others. And Zwilman, they lived out here. My father knew some of them. And I was in a position where I didn't have to worry about that. I was young guy, but I was independent.
Yeah.
I came out of the Navy. I got promoted. I came out, I was a lieutenant commander. I went in as an ensign, retired out of the Navy, and I came out of the U.S. Attorney's Office. And so fortunately, I won a little case that had some notoriety before these things happened, but there weren't that many people that came out of the U.S. Attorney's Office. Organized crime was just starting. All of a sudden, I had a little federal case, and I won that case where that guy was going to be deported. And there weren't that many lawyers at that
Yeah.
time that did. There were only 5 lawyers in the prosecutor's office at that time. Now there's probably 60 or 70. So it was a small community, and people knew my father, and I grew up in that community. But I could be independent in that sense.
Okay. So,
Once you win a couple of cases, people come to you.
yeah, 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 and you don't have to. You can easily set a boundary. I'm a lawyer myself and former policeman, and I had some criminal cases, and it's easy to set a boundary that, here's what I do for you. I just represent you in court, and when we get done, you go on your way, you pay me, or you pay me up front, because I'm not taking a chance that he's going to walk away and with whatever he gets and not pay me, of course. And so you set a boundary, and that's what people really don't understand is when you walk into those cases that you set a boundary immediately with
But you
these
had
guys.
to keep a certain distance, too, not to get too familiar or whatever, and that's good. There's certain formalities, and that separates the men from the boys.
There you go. That's a good way to put it. Now, historically,
Well,
we
a
know that
lot of
Frank Sinatra was hand in glove with a lot of mob guys. So tell us about
well,
that.
on a particular occasion, remember Sinatra grew up in Hoboken. The
Right.
original Provenzano Union was there, so before all that, they knew each other. As time went on, one time, I was out, Tony Pro, we were at some negotiations in Nevada, and Sinatra was performing at the Sands, and he said to me, "Would you like to meet Frank Sinatra?" Well, Sinatra didn't mean that much to me.
Yeah.
I said, "Yeah, sure." So we went to the stage door to see Sinatra. He knocks on the door. He knew Sinatra quite well, obviously. Knocks on the door, and Sinatra's right-hand guy, I forget his name as we're speaking, comes to the door, and Tony says, "Tell Mr. Sinatra that Tony Pro is here." So we said, "Oh, just wait a minute." He shut the door. He comes back, and he said, "I'm sorry, Mr. Provenzano, but Mr. Sinatra can't see you."
Oh.
And Tony Pro was so mad, he kicked the door and so forth and so on. But of
Ooh,
course, Sinatra had his own problems because he couldn't be seen out there with a member of organized crime, which
yeah.
Tony Pro had classified for. I tried to explain that to him because then he would be ineligible to perform under the license under the Nevada State Gambling Commission.
Yeah. Also talk about Tony Pro and his connection to Hoffa. What can you tell us about that?
Well, they had a most interesting relationship from my observation. Hoffa was probably one of the most independent people I ever knew,
Hmm.
with no sense of humor.
Oh,
And
really?
Tony Pro was a very entertaining guy. I mean, I've seen him. He could be the most charming
Yeah.
and the most difficult person, depending on the circumstances. But his personality seemed to really appeal to Hoffa. And in many respects, he was very independent because Hoffa was very demanding. But he was almost on a level. And Hoffa, I got the impression that Hoffa was very dependent because Tony was a very personable person. He knew everybody, every place we ever went.
Hmm.
I mean, he could be a charming type rogue, but
Interesting.
but I never had any problems. He and I always got along very, very well. Um,
What do you remember
so
about the famous quarrel between Hoffa and Tony Pro?
Yeah, I recall that. That was out in Lewisburg in
Right.
Pennsylvania. That was interesting. But what happened was when Hoffa went to prison, he didn't lose his pensions. He had a very substantial pension when he left the unions.
Hmm.
But when Tony Pro uh, was put on the sidelines because he was no longer able to be a member of labor unions or be an officer of any labor unions, he forfeited his pension,
Oh,
and
wow.
he always believed when Fitzsimmons took over the Teamsters unions that Hoffa could influence Fitzsimmons to for Tony Pro to get his pension benefits, that they shouldn't be forfeited. Why should Hoffa have gotten his? But
Yeah.
Hoffa was convicted of a crime that didn't require his forfeiture.
Hmm.
The Tony Pro, under the Taft-Hartley Act and everything, was different. Tony Pro never got through his head that it couldn't be done, and Hoffa made a couple of remarks, and Tony Pro lost his head, and he went after Hoffa in the meeting room. It was no big deal. It was, that was very unpleasant.
Yeah. Okay. I understand now that Tony Pro's conviction was for crimes in connection with union activity, while Jimmy Hoffa's conviction was for jury tampering that didn't have anything to do with
Union
union
affairs.
activity. That's why he got to keep his pension and Tony Pro didn't. I understand now why. I'd see why Tony Pro was mad, but
Well,
he.
he had a hot temper.
So speaking of all that relationship, this hitman that worked for him, did you know him? Sally Bugs Brugulio?
Yes, I know him quite
Oh,
well.
tell us about your relationship with him, and tell us, your opinion of him, what you remember about Sally Bugs. Kind of purportedly the man that killed Jimmy Hoffa, possibly.
Well, he was always a target. He was a target of that, and as was Tony Pro, as cold as ice, and he went his own way, and he was a very independent guy, and a nasty kind of guy too. I really never got along that well, or I was never that friendly with him. Very frankly, he was really like a bodyguard or chauffeur, but he was a business agent
Hmm.
at Local 560, and he was on the board of trustees of the union. And I had a big argument with him at the Teamsters pension fund, and there's still a guy who was there who witnessed it, who's still alive. I spoke to him just the other day, named Bob Archibald, who was one of the trucking company appointees to the board of trustees, and Preguglio wanted to have the board, the pension fund, give a mortgage. That became a big issue to some people from Detroit. And he outlined it, because the pension funds often made investments. We had investment advisors. It was a huge, big pension fund, and I was the attorney. But I was appointed, or not appointed, but I was selected, to keep everything on the up and up. So I said I would not approve. I recommended against it and so forth. They said, "Look, you're here for legal advice, not what to do or not to do." And he threatened me, and we never got along too well after that. But he
Wow.
threatened
Wow.
me,
That's
and Bob Archibald, who is still alive, was there. Uh, Most of the other guys are gone. Bob
yeah.
Archibald just turned 101 a couple of
Huh,
months ago.
interesting. That was bold of you to not approve a pension loan that Sally Bugs wanted approved. That was pretty bold. People have been killed for less, I think,
Well,
in
they
that
went and they
world.
did the mortgage, though. That was the
Oh yeah.
problem.
Well, they
And
got
they
it
went to
done. Okay.
Florida and they put the mortgage on, and some other lawyers handled it. I wouldn't do
Yeah,
it.
wouldn't touch it.
And
That's
so then,
interesting.
and the guys who got it were later indicted because the deal fell through. They were tried by a federal judge named Alistair Hastings, who Alistair Hastings then was, after that trial, was impeached by the United States Senate, and they took his judgeship away for allegedly taking bribes. So then, after he lost his judgeship, he ran Fort Lauderdale to become a U.S. House of Representatives representative, and he got elected, and he served in the House of Representatives for 30 years, believe it or not, and he died.
Believe it or not. Only in America, as they say.
What seemed to have happened was when Hoffa got out, he was pardoned by Nixon. He got the pardon, but he was supposed to be pardoned a year earlier. Hoffa, because as we said before, did not forfeit his right to go back to become a Union official, so he was still eligible. So he was supposed to get a year sooner. He was thought to get out at Christmas. In those days, if I can remember, pardons were really only granted by a president just before Christmas. And that year, he was promised or thought he was going to get the pardon. In the last minute, it got canceled, and he went nuts. So finally, it got put back on the next year. But when they got it the next year and he got the pardon, it had been the former international lawyer for the Union was a good friend of mine who I later, during some of these days, got to meet, and friendly, a guy named Edward Bennett Williams, who was
I've heard of
the
him.
finest, greatest lawyer I always looked up to. What happened was he had resigned. He had some differences, and he resigned and a new lawyer took over. And when the pardon was drawn and given to Hoffa, they put in the pardon that he could not become a Union official anymore. And that was not Hoffa's understanding of what the deal was. So when he got out, he wanted to go back to the Union, and he wanted to get the pardon revised. So he was threatening everybody. So he was threatening people that if he didn't get back to Union office and didn't get the pardon revised, feeling that people could influence the president or whatever, that he would give evidence against others or whatever. But I never knew anything further until I heard about his disappearance. And now I had this coincidental experience just last year when I knew that they were looking for Hoffa all over the place.
Yeah.
The FBI could never dig up. They must have gotten lots of tips of where Hoffa was buried. And they dug up two or three places in New Jersey, right under the Pulaski Skyway.
Yeah, I read
Two or
about
three
that.
different times. And one day I was out playing golf with some friends of mine. I was introduced to someone there, and who I had never met before, and he was just new, as meet so and so. When he heard my name, he said, "I've always wanted to meet you. There's a story I want to tell you." And he proceeded to tell me exactly where Hoffa was buried.
Oh, really?
And why and how he was there to see it and what he described. And there's some stuff in the book about it.
All right. Well, that's a pretty good teaser
I
to buy that
believe,
book.
based upon what he told me, and he told me that at the time that it happened, during the FBI investigation, and they were digging up, he said he called and reported it to the New York Times, but he never heard anything. And all these years had gone by. He's now in his middle 70s, this guy who I met at Mountain Ridge Country Club. But what he described, I absolutely believe that that's exactly where Hoffa is buried, within a couple of 100 yards of where the FBI had apparently gotten some tips of where he was buried.
Oh, back in New Jersey, those
New
Jersey
Jersey,
tips. Yeah.
not under the Pulaski Skyway, not far from the Pulaski Skyway.
Yeah, I interviewed that guy that came up with that theory, and he had some pretty convincing arguments that the people, as he related the people that told the stories about where he was and how he ended up back east, that it was pretty convincing argument, enough that the Bureau did spend a bunch of money to
This
go out
guy
there and
told
dig
me he
around.
saw it.
He
He
saw it.
saw it.
Wow.
He's
All
still
right.
alive.
Well, I tell you what, if you can dig that body up, you can get a lot of hits on the internet. I know that. That would be a big deal. That would be huge to dig up Jimmy Hoffa's body. It's taken on mythical proportions, as you know. This Tony Provenzano, and he was taking a lot of money personally out, and these guys were really raiding the Teamsters pension fund in a way. What did you see? Do you have one last question? How would you comment on the efficacy of the loans that the Teamsters pension fund made? I get a lot of questions about that. Did the mob really hurt the pension fund, or did they? Some people would say, "Oh yeah, all those loans they got paid back," or were there a lot of defaults? Do you have any comment on that?
Well, I can tell you this. I can only tell you, I was the only pension funds that I were aware were here in New Jersey that I was counseled to.
Okay.
The only suspicion I ever had was that one I just described to you a little while ago. We had the best investment advisors, and the pension funds were extremely successful in their investments. We had the biggest investment advisors on Wall Street. It was very, very, very carefully monitored.
Okay. So the New Jersey pension fund was different from the one in Chicago. It
That
was
was,
different.
I think the one in Chicago must have been huge. I
It
mean, we
was.
had a big fund here for its size at that time, but the pension fund here was as clean as a whistle.
Okay. All right. Interesting to know. All right. Chris Franzblau. The name of the book is The Last Mob Lawyer, True Stories from the Man Who Defended Some of the Biggest Names in Organized Crime. Chris, it's a fascinating book. I got the PDF, and I've read some bits and pieces as much as I could. I got to get back into it now because you've kind of stirred me up where I want to learn more out of out of your experiences. So I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Anytime.
Well, that was pretty interesting, guys. That guy, he's seen a lot of history, man, a lot of history. So don't forget, I like to ride motorcycles. If you are out there in your car and your big 10,000-pound SUV, watch out for motorcycles when you're out there because you can squash us like a bug. If you have a problem with PTSD, be sure and go to the VA website if you have been a vet. And if you haven't been a vet, well, figure out some other place to go get some help because there's help available. And PTSD affects a lot of people. And hand in glove with PTSD is problems with drugs and alcohol. They always, if you get treated for one, you probably got the other. Our friend Anthony Ruggiano from the Gambino crime family is a drug and alcohol counselor down in Florida, and he has a hotline on his YouTube channel or his website, one of the two or both of them, maybe. I can't remember. And if you have a problem with gambling, there's 1-800-BETS-OFF, at least here in Missouri. Getting ready to do the apps for for gambling. And there's a lot more and more gambling is out there, more and more opportunities. I don't really care for it myself. I lose $20 at a casino, and I like, oh shit, get me out of here. But it's everybody isn't like that. Everybody has a different appetite for that kind of risk with their money, and so if you feel like it's causing any trouble, why try to get some help for that. Don't forget, I've got books and movies out there. I'll have a link to The Last Mob Lawyer down there at the show notes. I will have links to my books and my documentaries that you can stream for just, I think, $1.99 on Amazon, or I've got them on my website. I figured out a way you can stream them off my website, and I get the whole $1.99 instead of only 95 cents of it or whatever it is. And the books the same way. I got them on my website, or you can get them on Amazon, which is a lot easier, and you get the Kindle books, which is a lot cheaper if you like Kindles. And so help me out with those books every time, and give me a review on those books. I didn't get many reviews on my New York book. I didn't really kind of push people on that. I did push them a little bit to buy it, but I didn't remind them to give me a review. And I've got I've sold more books than the Chicago books, but I've got less reviews. So it helps for me to get reviews on those books. Why you help out the podcast because you sell more books and then I get more money and I'm more more enthused about doing the podcast and this is, you got to watch a few ads, but other than that, it's all free content here. So thanks a lot, guys. 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 So